This is Flashback, and it has George Lucas syndrome. However, that's one of the reasons you should avoid this game. Developed by VectorCell and published by Ubisoft, Flashback is a remake of the classic 1992 game of the same name. It's a single-player action puzzle platformer where you take the role of Conrad B. Hart, a human who discovers his memory's been erased by receiving a pre-recorded message from himself. Conrad not only has to regain his memory, but he has to stop a conspiracy that could destroy the entire universe. Since this is a remake, the developers took the chance to flesh out the story and the world of Flashback a bit. Now, normally this would be considered sacrilege by fans of the original game, since tampering with a well-regarded game rarely ever goes well, but VectorCell is composed of a number of people who actually worked on the original Flashback, including the lead director, writer, and designer, Paul Cuisset. They're the people who pushed the remake, and they're the ones best suited for the job. Although since Cuiset's previous game experience includes 2012's critically panned Amy and the infamous Shaq Fu, it's understandable why people might be worried about this remake. Sadly, those worries may have actually been justified too, since the additions they made don't really add anything necessary to the game. Conrad now has a love interest that you never see in person for the entire game besides in memory flashes, and characters who were originally one-time use NPCs suddenly appear in multiple locations or even become boss fights. While these changes might seem unnecessary to point out, as a result of them the story suddenly has a number of plot holes that weren't there in the first place. To a person playing Flashback for the first time, the changes will be completely unnoticeable, but the plot holes will be noticeable for both newcomers and fans of the original, leaving both groups confused at times unless some suspension of disbelief is exercised. Alongside the story, the graphics and gameplay have been updated, and to VectorCell's credit, the game looks really good. Running off the Unreal Engine, locations look highly detailed and incredibly busy while suffering very little to no slowdown at all. Each stage of the game looks distinct, and there are some really nice lighting effects in play at certain portions. The HUD and menus are all stylized and match the futuristic setting. The character models all look nice, and everyone looks much more distinct from each other than they did in the original, although for some reason Conrad now looks like he's trying to be Nathan Drake's body double. While the graphics aren't as distinct as the original's rotoscoped artwork, it still looks nice and fits in well with the current generation of games. The music's also been updated and sounds quite nice as well. A number of the tracks are updated versions of the original game's songs, while still maintaining the electronic and futuristic feel of the originals. The music fires you up during tense situations and helps the story along, although there are a number of points where instead of music you'll get ambient noise, which can make the game feel like it's just plodding along, but thankfully those are few and far between. While the audio and visual updates to the game are mostly positive, the same can't be said for the changes made to the gameplay. The original Flashback was a platforming game that required a lot of tight maneuvering and a lot of puzzle solving with some light combat elements. It was somewhat vague about what you had to do next and required a lot of critical thinking to make it through. The remake pretty much throws that all out of the window. Now the game is an action platforming game with a heavy focus on combat and light puzzle elements. You can now aim in all directions with the right thumbstick, and you'll find yourself frequently fighting off enemies. With the change in focus on combat though, the game's overall difficulty has been lowered, since a large amount of the instant kill traps from the original game are now either gone, or they just do light damage. There's still ways to be killed instantly, but they're so few and far between that it really doesn't matter. This changes the game from a mostly trial and error puzzle platformer to just a standard run and gun game with some platforming elements. While the easier difficulty does make the game easier to tolerate for newcomers, fans of the original might not appreciate the switch up. With the shift to more action-based gameplay, VectorCell added a leveling up system and power-up collectibles to Flashback. By killing enemies and solving puzzles, Conrad earns experience to level up, which grants him skill points to put into one of 3 stats. There are also a number of random power-ups scattered throughout the world that'll grant various perks like more health or a stronger gun. These elements, combined with the in-game HUD and the Metroid-style grid-based map, make the game look and feel like Shadow Complex, but Flashback is nowhere near as polished. Conrad's controls are way too loose, and you'll find yourself slipping around and ragdolling a bunch. At some points you'll try to dodge attackers by climbing ledges, but you'll suddenly find yourself running back to the enemy even if you aren't holding that direction. That's never a good sign for a platformer. On top of that, your stat points feel like they don't change your character at all, and even enemies that are lower level than you still take the same amount of hits to kill, or sometimes more. It also doesn't help that it's impossible to get all the power-up collectibles in one playthrough since they don't all appear. Flashback's power-up system is designed to encourage players to play through the game multiple times on multiple difficulties, with each playthrough putting in more power-ups so you can max out Conrad's strength. This is also done to encourage speedrunning the game, as the game has a leaderboard for clear time. But since the game has a glitch that lets players reset the in-game clock at the very end of the game, the leaderboard's useless since the game thinks people can clear the game in under 5 minutes. That's not the only glitch in the game, however. There are a number of exceptionally bad ones in this game. The one I encountered the most was the one that removed Conrad's ability to walk. I first encountered it 5 minutes into my first playthrough and stopped counting how many times it happened after the 10th time. I also encountered map glitches that put item markers in fake spots, removing them from the actual item locations, false ledges that got me trapped in walls, and elevators that clipped through ceilings, dropping me back to the bottom of the elevator shaft, and never respawning, making the game unwinnable unless I restarted the stage. For a game that took about 5 hours to complete while taking my time doing everything, and can probably complete it in under 2 hours while speedrunning, that's absolutely unacceptable. As a bonus, the designers have made the original game playable on the main menu. This is a nice extra since you're essentially getting 2 games for the price of 1, and this is one of the few legal ways you can actually play the original Flashback. Presumably they added it to highlight the major differences between the 2 games, but it had an adverse effect on me. I actually found myself more interested in the original game than the remake. It might have been the difficulty or the fact that I had no nostalgia for the game, but I found I had a better time playing the original over the remake. Others might not feel the same, as the original can be unforgivingly difficult and has a steep learning curve, but it feels much more rewarding to play and complete than the remake. Sadly though, even this version has extra problems since it doesn't run full screen, instead running in its small native resolution, and it also seems to be lacking a soundtrack, presumably because VectorCell couldn't get the rights to any of the original music. Flashback is out now on the Xbox 360 for $10, with PS3 and Steam versions scheduled for later this year. While there are some people out there who will want to try this game, such as fans curious about the new changes, newcomers who are curious about the series, or those looking for a cheap, legal way to play the original game, the glitches, the aggravating combat, the shaky controls, and missing features will sour the experience too much. Unless you're feeling adventurous and have some money to spare, you should avoid Flashback.